The crystal wine glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the pristine white tablecloth as the manila envelope landed in front of me. A sharp sting spread across my palm, but I barely registered the pain. 20 pairs of eyes locked onto me, some wide with shock, others alight with barely contained amusement. The rich scent of turkey and cranberry sauce now felt nauseating. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice steadier than I thought possible. "What is this?" "Divorce papers." Emerson's voice was flat, practiced, rehearsed. A slow chill crept up my spine as I turned to look at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "I thought it would be better to do this here," he added, adjusting his cufflinks like he wasn't tearing my world apart. "With family present. Better for whom?" The question died on my tongue as Cora, my sister-in-law, let out a low chuckle, swirling the wine in her glass. She had been waiting for this moment since the day I married into the family. "You're serving me divorce papers at Thanksgiving dinner?" I forced the words out, each syllable laced with disbelief. "Well, darling," Eleanor, my mother-in-law, leaned forward, the flickering candlelight catching the glint of satisfaction in her cold blue eyes. "We thought it would be easier this way. The family can provide emotional support." Cora snorted. "Like she needs any. Maybe now she'll finally realize that art isn't a career path. Didn't your last gallery show end with not a single sale?" She tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "Must have been humiliating." Laughter rippled through the room. Even the cousins I once thought were on my side chuckled under their breath. I gripped the edge of the table, my wounded hand trembling. The blood dripping onto the tablecloth looked almost poetic, like something out of one of my paintings. I had given 5 years to this family. 5 years of biting my tongue, of enduring their mockery, of being treated like an outsider. And now, they had the audacity to humiliate me like this, as if I were nothing. I forced myself to breathe, my fingers brushing against my purse where a folded document had been sitting for months. A drunken promise, long forgotten by Emerson, but not by me. I stood slowly, the blood from my hand staining Eleanor's immaculate tablecloth. "You're right, Eleanor." My voice was soft but steady, carrying over the stunned silence. "I don't belong in this family." I reached into my purse and pulled out the deed. "Which is why you'll be the ones leaving." A fork clattered against a plate. Eleanor's carefully controlled expression faltered for the first time. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I smiled, holding up the signed deed. "This estate? It's mine. Emerson signed it over to me last year." He was too drunk to remember, but I made sure the paperwork was filed. Emerson's face drained of color. "That's not possible." "Oh, but it is." I glanced around the table, watching the realization sink in. "So, while you all sit here celebrating my humiliation, I think you should also start considering where you'll be moving. Because as of now, you're trespassing on my property." A stunned silence fell over the room. Then chaos erupted. Eleanor shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the polished wood floor. "You ungrateful little..." "Careful," I cut in smoothly. "I'd hate to have to call security on my first night as the new owner." Cora gaped at me, for once at a loss for words. Emerson finally spoke, his voice tight with anger. "Olive, we need to talk about this." I picked up my coat, turning toward my best friend, the only person in this room who had ever truly supported me. "Would you mind driving me to the emergency room? Seems I've cut myself." Then, as the Blakes sat in stunned silence, I walked out of that house, my house, without looking back. Allie's grip on the steering wheel was tight, her knuckles white as we sped away from the estate. I pressed a napkin to my bleeding palm, watching the Blake mansion shrink in the rearview mirror. The warmth of the house's glowing windows mocked me, an illusion of hospitality, much like the family inside. "Are you okay?" Allie asked, glancing at me, concern etched into her features. I let out a breath, my chest tight with emotions I wasn't ready to unpack. "Not yet," I admitted. "But I will be." I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded deed, smoothing it over my lap. The sight of Emerson's sloppy signature sent a wave of grim satisfaction through me. I wasn't bluffing back there, I murmured, holding it up for Ally to see. Her eyes flicked to the paper, then widened. Wait, this is real? As real as Eleanor's Botox. I let out a dry laugh. He signed it over to me last year.
Drunk.
I filed the paperwork the next morning. Ally nearly swerved off the road. Holy Olive, you own the estate. I nodded, the weight of it finally sinking in.
Yeah.
And I have no idea what to do with it. Silence stretched between us as the city lights blurred past. Then, slowly, a thought took shape, an idea, bold and undeniable. The Blakes had always mocked me, dismissed me. But what if I turned their beloved estate into something they'd never expect? Something they'd have to watch thrive from a distance? A slow smile crept onto my face. Ally noticed. Oh no. I know that look. You're planning something. Maybe, I said, my mind already spinning. But first, let's get my hand stitched up. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed I'd need stitches, 7 to be exact. As he worked, I pulled out my phone and called Riley. Please tell me you're calling because you finally want to use that deed, she said by way of greeting. I grinned despite the sting in my palm. That's exactly why I'm calling. By the time I left the hospital, Riley had already set up a meeting for the next morning. Back at Ally's apartment, I curled up on her couch, scrolling through my phone. The messages from the Blakes came in rapid succession. Furious texts from Emerson, venomous ones from Eleanor, and an almost laughable attempt at guilt-tripping from Cora. I ignored them all. Ally handed me a glass of wine in a plastic cup, settling onto the armrest beside me. So, what's the plan? I took a sip before answering. They always mocked me for being a failed artist, but they never bothered to look past the surface. I turned my phone screen toward her, pulling up a website. My website. Ally's jaw dropped. Olive, what is this? My art restoration business, I said, pride swelling in my chest. I built it quietly on my own, and it's doing better than they could ever imagine. Ally whistled. They're gonna lose their minds when they find out. I smirked. Good. Because I'm just getting started. A sharp knock rattled Ally's apartment door. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Olive opened the door. Emerson's voice was tight, urgent. We need to talk. Ally glanced at me from the kitchen, her eyebrows raised. Want me to handle him? I shook my head, setting down my coffee.
No.
I've got this. I opened the door to find Emerson standing there, looking far less put together than usual. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and the dark circles under his eyes made him look like he hadn't slept. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. What do you want, Emerson? His jaw tightened. You know why I'm here. If it's about the estate, you should talk to my lawyer. His nostrils flared. Olive, this is ridiculous. You can't seriously be going through with this. I tilted my head. Going through with what, exactly? Enforcing a legal document that you willingly signed. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. You can't just take the house from my family. I shrugged. That's funny because last night, they had no problem taking my dignity. Come on, Olive. You don't even want that house. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You think I haven't heard every cruel thing your family has said about me? They laughed at my art, belittled my career, treated me like an outsider. While they were busy mocking me, I was busy building something. Emerson scoffed. What, your little painting hobby? I pulled out my phone and opened my website, shoving it into his hands. His face paled as he scrolled through the client list, the testimonials, the sold-out bookings for my restoration business. I built this on my own, I said. Without you. Without them. For the first time since he'd arrived, Emerson looked uncertain. Olive, please. His voice softened. This house, it was meant for Cora. He hesitated, then exhaled. She's pregnant. I blinked. And he looked at me like I was supposed to be moved by this revelation. It's tradition, he pressed. Every generation raises their children in that house. It's supposed to be, for her child now. I arched an eyebrow. You mean my house? Emerson's lips parted, but no words came out. I let out a breath, shaking my head. I spent 5 years bending over backward to be good enough for your family. And in the end, they tossed me aside like I was disposable. You expect me to care about tradition? His expression hardened. You're making a mistake. No, Emerson. I met his gaze, unwavering. I made a mistake 5 years ago when I married you. I took a step back and began to close the door. If you have a problem with me owning the estate, talk to your lawyer. His hand shot out, catching the door. This isn't over, Olive. I smiled. Yes, Emerson. It is. And with that, I shut the door in his face. Francisco's studio smelled of varnish, old books, and the quiet hum of possibility. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over canvases in various states of repair. He looked up from his latest project, a centuries-old portrait with deep cracks running through the paint, and gave me a knowing smile. So, he said, setting down his brush. You finally told them to go to hell. I let out a breathless laugh, still running on the adrenaline of the last 24 hours. Something like that. He gestured to the stool across from him. Tell me everything. I pulled out the deed and placed it between us. I own the estate, Francisco. I own it. And I don't just want to sit on it out of spite. My fingers traced the edges of the paper. I want to turn it into something meaningful. A gallery. A restoration studio. A place where art gets a second life. Francisco leaned back, considering me. And what will you fill this gallery with? I blinked. Well, restored pieces, exhibitions. No. He shook his head. You're thinking too small. He gestured to the paintings around us. Restoration isn't just about making something look new again. It's about revealing history, showing people the beauty in imperfection. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with excitement. What if he didn't just display the art? What if he let people witness the restoration process itself? I sat back, stunned by the idea. Picture it, he continued. One wing of the gallery shows the damaged works, art forgotten, neglected, left to decay. Another wing is the studio. Guests watch as your team carefully brings these pieces back to life. And, in the final gallery, the restored masterpieces. A complete journey from ruin to renewal. A slow smile spread across my face. Like a metaphor. Francisco's lips quirked. Exactly. I glanced around his studio, at the broken frames and faded canvases, waiting for new life. This was what I wanted to create, not just revenge, but resurrection. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of certainty settle in my chest. I'm going to do it. Francisco beamed. Now that's the Olive I know. We spent the next hour sketching out ideas, pulling up the estate's floor plans, and discussing logistics. The grand hall would be the main gallery, flooded with natural light. The east wing would house the restoration studio, complete with viewing areas for visitors. The west wing? A space for artists like me, those dismissed, underestimated, to create and exhibit their work. By the time I left, my head was buzzing with ideas. Francisco clapped me on the shoulder before I walked out. You're about to change the art world and make your former in-laws absolutely miserable. I'd call that a masterpiece. I grinned. Then let's make some art. The sound of drills and hammers echoed through the grand halls of the estate, the walls stripped of their outdated wallpaper, making way for something new. Scaffolding lined the main gallery space, where workers repainted high ceilings in warm, inviting tones. The scent of fresh paint and sawdust filled the air, a scent of transformation. I stood in the center of it all, blueprint in hand, as contractors confirmed installation dates for the gallery lighting. This place, once a suffocating monument to the Blakes' wealth, was finally becoming something real. Then came the shouting. Let me through. This is my home. Eleanor. I exhaled slowly, bracing myself as I walked to the front entrance. Through the wrought iron gate, I saw her, clad in an impeccably tailored coat, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She stood at the gate, fury radiating off her in waves, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she caught sight of me. Olive, she sneered. Tell your little security guard to open this gate immediately. I crossed my arms. I don't think so. Her lips thinned. This is my family's estate. I leaned against the gate, tilting my head.
Funny.
I checked the paperwork this morning, and it still has my name on it. She scoffed, stepping closer. You are ruining a legacy centuries in the making. You. I am creating something. I cut in, my voice even. Something that will actually matter. I gestured to the work happening behind me. You see those walls going up? They aren't just for decoration. They're going to hold art that people will come from across the country to see. Eleanor's nostrils flared. You think this circus, will be anything more than a footnote? I smiled, pulling my phone from my pocket and opening my email. Well, according to the multiple art collectors and critics who have RSVP'd for the grand opening, it seems they disagree. I scrolled down the list, reading off names she definitely recognized. I watched, fascinated, as the realization dawned on her. She had lost. For so long, she had ruled over this house like a queen, dictating who was worthy and who wasn't. And now, she wasn't just being removed from her throne, her kingdom was being rewritten entirely. You have no power here, Eleanor. I let the words sink in before adding, enjoy your new view from the outside. Her hands curled into fists, her carefully composed expression cracking for the first time. You will regret this. I smiled, stepping back toward the entrance. No, Eleanor. The only regret I have is not taking this house sooner. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing outside the gates, an unwelcome guest at what was once her estate. As I re-entered the house, the noise of construction filled my ears again. But this time, it didn't feel chaotic. It felt like progress. The night was electric. Soft jazz played over the hum of voices as guests moved through the newly transformed estate, admiring the works displayed on pristine, white walls. The chandeliers, once symbols of old money pretension, now illuminated something entirely different: art, restoration, and the quiet defiance of a woman who had refused to be broken. I stood near the entrance, watching as critics murmured their approval, collectors eyed pieces for purchase, and photographers captured every moment. Francisco approached, handing me a champagne flute. Your victory lap is well earned, he said, clinking his glass against mine. I exhaled, feeling the weight of it all. The years of dismissal, the humiliation of that last Thanksgiving, the doubts that once gnawed at me, now replaced by something solid. Satisfaction. A soft chime signaled the evening's main event. The guests gathered in the center of the main gallery, where a large, covered canvas stood waiting. Francisco stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice warm with pride, it is my great honor to introduce the centerpiece of tonight's exhibition. A deeply personal work by the artist and visionary who made this gallery possible, Olive. Applause rippled through the crowd as I took the stage, my heart steady. This triptych, I began, glancing at the veiled work behind me, is a story. One of loss, of rebuilding, of discovering that what breaks us does not have to define us. I reached for the fabric and pulled it away. Gasps echoed through the room. The left panel depicted a shattered wine glass, the deep crimson of spilled wine bleeding across the canvas, a frozen moment of destruction. The center panel was chaos, jagged lines and dark hues swirling together, the confusion of pain and betrayal. But the right panel was transformation. The broken pieces had reassembled, but not as they were before. Instead, they formed something new, a kaleidoscope of light, color, and strength. A rebirth. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was awestruck. Then, a sharp, familiar voice sliced through the reverence. How dare you? I turned, unsurprised to find Eleanor and Emerson pushing their way through the crowd, their expressions a mix of outrage and desperation. Eleanor's heels clicked furiously against the floor as she marched toward me. You think this ridiculous spectacle makes you better than us? Emerson, standing just behind her, looked far less composed. This house, this legacy, it isn't yours to rewrite, he said, his voice low but seething. I met his gaze head-on. That's where you're wrong. A true legacy isn't about preserving something lifeless. It's about transforming it into something meaningful. I gestured to the triptych. You see destruction. I see possibility. You see brokenness. I see art. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Guests eyed Eleanor and Emerson with growing disapproval. The very people they once sought to impress now looked at them as the relics of a past best left behind. Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides. You have ruined everything. No, Eleanor, I said softly. I created something. And the fact that you can't see, that is exactly why you lost. Emerson exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. He looked around, taking in the disapproving gazes, the unmistakable success of the gallery. He knew it was over. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Eleanor lingered for a moment longer, her jaw clenched, her pride refusing to let her go quietly. But when no one came to her defense, when the weight of her own irrelevance pressed down on her, she finally turned on her heel and followed her son into the night. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding slipped from my lips. Francisco raised his glass. To transformation. The crowd erupted into applause. I looked at the triptych one last time, letting its meaning settle into my bones. Not broken. Not destroyed. Reborn. The news broke like a tidal wave, crashing over the city's elite with brutal force. Blake financial empire in ruins. Fraud, embezzlement, and a family's downfall. Once powerful Blakes face federal investigation. I stood in Francisco's studio, phone in hand, scrolling through the endless headlines. Every news station had picked up the scandal. Eleanor and Emerson had been exposed for mismanaging client funds, covering up losses, and siphoning money into hidden accounts. If I hadn't taken legal ownership of the estate when I did, it would have been seized along with the rest of their assets. They would have lost it anyway. Francisco glanced up from his workbench, wiping his hands on a rag. Well, he said, smirking, karma really doesn't miss, does it? I exhaled, shaking my head. I knew they were terrible, but this, I gestured to the article on my screen, detailing the upcoming federal hearings. They weren't just cruel. They were criminals. Before Francisco could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I frowned at the name on the screen.
Cora.
I hesitated before answering. What do you want? A sharp inhale. Then, Olive, please. Her voice was nothing like the woman who once sneered at my art, mocked my failures, laughed as I bled at Thanksgiving dinner. She sounded small, broken. I waited. They're gone, she whispered. Eleanor's in hiding. Emerson is trying to save himself, and I have nothing. Her voice cracked. I have no one. I closed my eyes. I should have felt satisfaction. The woman who spent years tearing me down was now calling, desperate, afraid. I had every right to hang up, but I didn't. Instead, I asked, "Where are you?" A pause. Then, softly, outside. I turned to the studio window, and there she was, standing at the gate, a single suitcase at her feet, her hands wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. Francisco stood beside me, watching. You don't owe her anything, you know. I sighed. I know. And yet, I walked to the door. When I reached the gate, Cora didn't meet my eyes. She looked thinner, exhausted, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined her. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quickly. I don't even expect kindness. But I'm pregnant. And I can't do this alone. I studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, I stepped aside and gestured toward the guest house.
It's small, I said.
But it's clean. Cora's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. You'd let me stay? I crossed my arms. I'm not you, Cora. She swallowed hard, nodding, and picked up her suitcase. As she walked past me toward the guest house, I turned back to Francisco, who was watching from the doorway. He raised an eyebrow. You're either a saint or an idiot. I shrugged. Maybe I just know that broken things deserve a second chance. The scent of varnish and aged canvas filled the air as I carefully guided a student's hand over a delicate section of an old painting. Gentle strokes, I murmured. Restoration isn't about erasing the past. It's about revealing what's still there, beneath the damage. The young artist nodded, focusing intently. I stepped back, surveying the studio. The gallery had become more than just an exhibition space. It was a living place of art, where restoration and creation coexisted. Students worked at their stations, discussing techniques, discovering their craft. This was what I had built, and it was thriving. The doorbell rang, interrupting the steady hum of work. I glanced up at the security camera screen. Eleanor. I hesitated for only a second before walking to the entrance. She stood at the gate, her usual air of superiority absent. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a simple coat, clutching a large, covered canvas in her arms. "Olive," she said, her voice almost unsure. I crossed my arms. "What do you want, Eleanor?" For a long moment, she just looked at me, as if trying to decide whether to speak at all. Then, slowly, she lifted the canvas and unwrapped it. It was an old family portrait, cracked with time, faded at the edges, a small tear running through the face of a much younger Eleanor. "I found this in my mother's attic," she said. "It's damaged." I studied it, running my fingers lightly over the brittle paint. "And you want me to restore it?" She exhaled sharply. "You're the best at what you do." A pause. Then, softer. "And I don't want it lost forever." I tilted my head, considering her. This was the woman who had mocked me, who had once tried to take everything from me. And now, here she was, asking me to save something she had lost. I ran my fingers over a deep crack in the paint, tracing the damage. "This will never look the same," I told her honestly. "The cracks will still be there, no matter how carefully I restore it." Eleanor nodded, looking down at her own reflection in the glass of the frame. Maybe that's the point. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Regret. I sighed, taking the painting from her hands. "Come back in a few weeks. I'll see what I can do." She blinked, clearly surprised I hadn't shut the door in her face. But she didn't push. She only nodded, turning to leave. Back inside, Francisco raised an eyebrow. "Are you actually going to do it?" I looked down at the painting in my hands, at the layers of time and where that had shaped it. "Yes," I said simply, setting it on my workbench. Because restoration wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about transformation. And I, more than anyone, understood what it meant to be truly restored.